and we have National Geographic Channel, which I usually like because it's, it's nature, it's beautiful, it's informative. And I ran disturbingly across a program I hadn't seen before, Doomsday Preppers. Ever seen it? Have you heard of this show? On National Geographic? Doomsday Preppers. The premise of the show is that it discusses how effective certain doomsday plans, and they compare them against other doomsday colonies, I guess, usually groups of well-prepared and oftentimes, and really usually, well-armed individuals. And then I decided, well, I'm going to do a search on my, I can do a search on my TV, and I searched Doomsday, because, it is the season for that. And I found numerous shows and TV shows and documentaries, even that America has a doomsday plan, apparently. Who would have thought? I guess you need one. Movies of various types. That wasn't even an internet search. It was just a search on my TV. It's ironic to me that our society has turned away from the church because the church is often seen as judgmental. And yet the society is enamored with the extremes of judgment, of punishment, of destruction. Oddly enough, compared to the fantasies of our societal doomsday, where all manner of hell breaks loose, I think I'll take the biblical alternative, where the vision of that final day is that all heaven will break loose. And it's a day that we cannot, even should not, prepare for. As Christians, now this may be a surprise to certain types of Christians, as Christians, we are not doomsday preppers. We are those who believe that today is the day that we are to live fully. During the Sundays of November, as I said at the beginning, we near the end of the church year, and of course, in understanding how things will end, we have to address some of that with our readings, and we have a focus in our readings today. All three of our lessons look at those sorts of things. Our first is Malachi, and it speaks of the evil of his day and speaks of a day when the righteous will rejoice instead of suffering hardship, leaping with glee like calves from the stall. The second letter is Paul's second letter to, or the second reading is our second letter to the Thessalonians, of Paul giving direction to this very young Christian community that is expecting the imminent return of Christ. The imminent return of Christ is different than doomsday prepping. Okay? The expectation of Christ's imminent return has caused some in that community to sell all their possessions and to live communally. We see that even in the books of Acts. But some have decided that since Jesus is coming back any day, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, they don't any longer have to work. I mean, what's the point of working? What's the point of striving if it's all going to end tomorrow? So they've become now a burden on the Christian community, and Paul tells them that they should not be idle. The promise of salvation and Christ's imminent return should not result in a lack of being productive, nor should it result in a lax in doing what is good and what is right. And then in our gospel reading, we get this mini apocalypse. The word apocalypse does not mean doomsday, regardless as to what all those video games that you guys play say. The word apocalypse means the revealing. The revealing. God is going to reveal something, not wipe everything out. Jesus tells the disciples that the temple, so central to Judaism, that place where heaven and earth touch is the understanding of the temple. That place where God stabilizes the world because it's God's throne. It's the one place that the world is held secure. He says that will be destroyed. We know that by the time that Luke writes the gospel, the Romans have already destroyed the temple. What he's talking about in this foretelling has already occurred when Luke sits down to write it. Now, there are kind of, I think, a couple directions that you can go in when you're looking at texts like these. The first is we can take them as a warning, and we can start preparing for the end of which Jesus speaks, either by ordering our lives in a new way or by trying to figure out the events and calendar them to which Jesus supposedly alludes. There are plenty of Christians who do that. I have some in my own family who do that. Or we can chuck all that and hear these words as an invitation to live now by faith and by hope, invited by the prospect of future tribulation and trial, only to sharpen our deep appreciation for the present that God has created and given to us. You might guess which tack I'm going to take. As Lutherans, we don't read the Bible as a map to the future. We don't read it as a timeline or a calendar. We do not read them even as prophecies, or even more mistakenly, to misunderstand the word prophecy as fortune-telling or future-telling. Instead, we read the gospel as it explicitly states, as an exhortation to Christians who are under pressure, possibly under persecution, perhaps even in martyrdom, to stay steadfast, to be faithful. Now, as our gospel concludes this morning, by your endurance, you will save your souls. Jesus himself speaks against seeing writings like these as a timeline. Here, he alerts his disciples that there's going to be plenty of people who say, the time is near, or I'm the one, perhaps as if he expects the Hal Lindsays and the Harold Campings and the Tim LaHaye's of the world, so he warns us ahead of time about them. At other places in the Gospels, Jesus is even more explicit, saying that no one will know the day or the hour, and then we should take a cue from this, not even him. I suppose if Jesus doesn't even know, we should not suppose that we will have an inside track to when the end will come. And perhaps our spiritual arrogance needs to be pulled back a bit. Jesus counsels believers not only not to be alarmed. How many of you, when you hear your friends and neighbors, maybe even family members, talk about their church's apocalypticism, doesn't create some kind of alarm for you? Some kind of worry and hand-wringing. Perhaps you watch them wringing their hands about the times in which they live. Jesus tells us in this passage that the one thing we're not supposed to do is to be alarmed by all these things. But he also tells us not to plan. Now, I find that as sort of odd advice, especially living in California where we have earthquakes, and we're constantly planning and replanning and restocking water and various supplies. We're constantly planning for some disaster. This week we had a fire in our canyon. We were prepared. We had it all prepped up in advance. Jesus says in verse 14, so make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. Instead, he invites us to a living and active trust so that we may believe first that the various trials and difficulties are actually opportunities for us to witness. I happened to get a sneak peek of our stewardship talk this morning, and Bob's going to do just that. The difficult moment in their life has become an opportunity to witness to the power and faithfulness of God. That's exactly what Jesus is talking about this morning. And secondly, that Jesus himself will equip us to speak and will respond when such occasions arise, when we're connected with him. The Gospel of Luke was written after all the writings of St. Paul. In other words, it is written after our second lesson for today. It seems not like that's the case. The Gospel should be written before. There's almost no question that Luke is responding to the crises of the Christian community and addressing the words of Jesus to them in their hour of doubt and their hour of need. Now, this is a Christian community that has now survived the onslaught of the Romans, destroying the temple and basically cutting down everything, every building, every tree, everything that stood in their way, everything that this Jewish Christian community would have known and loved is now gone. And they themselves are seen as a reformist movement of Judaism, so they themselves are targets of such things. And so Luke is addressing these words to the real dangers, the real anxieties that these people are facing in their life. And the invitation is that we can respond most faithfully not by predicting the end of things, but by seizing the present moment in which to share our faith and to live in confidence in God's promise. He says, when you hear of wars and insurrections, of which at this time there are plenty, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place. And Jesus told them, nation's going to rise against nation, kingdom's going to rise against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes, super typhoons in various places, even famines and plagues. There's going to be dreadful portents in the heavens. Great signs. But before all that's going to occur, as if it could get worse, you're going to be arrested and persecuted. And they're going to hate you because of my name. And you're going to be brought before kings and governors and magistrates and judges. And as if it seems like that would be bad news, he suddenly changes on his heel, shifts on his heels, and says, it's going to give you a great opportunity to witness to the peace that you have in your spirit because of the real and living presence of Christ there. And because of his presence, because of your calmness, because of your faithfulness and steadfastness, the gospel will spread. And indeed, by the time Luke is writing his gospel, that is already happening. The gospel has spread throughout almost the entire known kingdom of Rome. So make up your minds in advance, he says, not to prepare your defense, for I will give you words and I will give you wisdom. There's going to be a time of trial, maybe a time of tribulation. If you're a student of world history, you know that that's almost a guarantee as we look forward. There's going to be a time of trial for us personally, there's going to be a time of trial for us corporately. And if you've lived any more than about 10 years, you've experienced both of those things. We aren't exempt from trouble, Jesus tells us. But neither will we be left alone. Jesus will provide for us his wise guidance. In times of need, Jesus promises them and us a strength that comes beyond themselves. And pay attention, I'm going to bookmark here for Bob a little bit later. Rabbi Harold Cushing, who wrote a number of books, Who Needs God is the book I'm going to quote from, reflects on this strength. I have seen weak people become strong, he writes. Timid people become brave. Selfish people become generous. I have seen people care for their elderly parents, for brain-damaged children, for wives in wheelchairs for years, even decades. And I've asked myself, where do people get the strength to keep doing that for so long? Where do they get the resources of love and loyalty to keep going? The only answer I can come up with is when we are weary and out of strength, we turn to God, and God renews our strength so we can run and not grow weary, so we can walk and not grow faint. Human institutions like the temple, or human governments like Herod's Israel or even Caesar's Roman Empire may not be able to withstand the tumult of the ages. But those who endure have carried the message forward, the message of God's faithfulness to God's people regardless to their circumstances, the message of the one who had died and was risen, was resurrected in each and every generation as we went hand over hand for now 2 millennia. The temple that was so central to the Jewish idea of where God was located, and that this temple was that place where God intersected with the earth and held it secure. That temple could not contain God. No temple ever could. God is looking for something a bit more homey, a bit more fleshly, like the human heart, like the human spirit. The implication is that the temple is not the center of the world, but the life that is formed and anchored in God, the calm individual held by Christ, is the true temple in the world. And that this message of endurance seems to be the center of what Jesus is talking about. As Christians, then, we can be free from the hand-wringing over overwhelming things in our future. We do not need to be doomsday preppers. God has taken care of the future. And we cannot control it even if we prepared for it. God's going to take care of it. the gospel tells us. So that frees us up to do some other things. If you're not busy packing guns and water and food in a bunker, think how much time you're going to have to do other things, like live right now, love one another right now, reconcile yourself to one another right now, serve the needy right now, live in God's peace right now, be a witness to Christ's present, not to the future, but right now, that God is with us and that He will never abandon us, and that the future is just a fulfillment of His love poured out for us in the cross that will be infinitely more even than that sacrifice, that His love will be God's final word, not the wiping out of everything, but the culmination of everything, the resurrection of everything, the restoration of everything, the redemption of everything, the hope of everything in Him. And because we don't have to worry about that future, you are free to live into that reality right here, right now, today.